Good evening, everyone. Tonight we start by exploring the extraordinary existence and tough spirit of medieval farmers. These unsung champions beat the odds to endure some of history's harshest, coldest nights. Their tale is packed with toughness, creativity, and persistence, from improvised ways to insulate to sharing warmth by sleeping together. So before settling in, please hit like and subscribe if you truly appreciate the content I create. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and the current time there. I love seeing our global audience gathering. Now lower the lights, perhaps switch on a fan to create a gentle hum, and let's transition into tonight's adventure. When medieval times come to mind, you likely picture knights and tournaments, splendid banquets, and cheerful festivals. However, for the typical serf, winter meant far less fun and far more, how will we survive this night? It wasn't merely a season, it was an annual endurance challenge, like a ruthless instructor who never gave a second opportunity. Imagine residing in a small shack built from mud and branches, with walls so flimsy you could hear a bird sneeze outdoors. Zero insulation, zero windows, except for a tiny opening blocked with animal hide, and certainly no fights with siblings over the thermostat. Your home's interior temperature was typically just a few degrees more bearable than the weather outdoors. When outside was freezing, inside was just a bit less freezing. Well done. Evenings were the hardest. Total darkness consumed all. The wind roared like a furious spirit, while the hearth fire flickered weakly. It tried valiantly, but mainly cooked the toes of those nearest. If you sat at the room's far end, you might as well have been camping outdoors only with inferior food. Attire offered little relief. Serfs lacked luxurious fur garments or feather-stuffed coverings. They owned a few coarse woolen shirts, perhaps a cape with a noticeable goat odor. The idea was that piling them on would make you resemble a human onion. Spoiler alert, that strategy failed. And forget cuddling under plush blankets. Sleeping arrangements were often just bags packed with dried grass or straw. Occasionally, they added some old reeds, plus fleas as unwanted companions. Luxury was not part of a medieval peasant's experience. The chill wasn't merely unpleasant, it was life-threatening. Frostbite, hypothermia, and freezing to death posed continual dangers, particularly to kids and seniors. Each morning you woke alive was a small miracle, perhaps celebrated with a turnip that wasn't completely frozen. Thus, enduring a medieval winter wasn't about coziness. It involved clenching teeth, stacking every garment available, curling up with animals, and hoping not to find icicles on your face. And that was just the start of the ordeal. If you grumble about a drafty apartment due to a faulty window, medieval farmers would have a strong opinion. Their dwellings weren't merely breezy, they were essentially eager wind tunnels topped with a roof. The majority of peasant homes used a method historians term wattle and daub. In simple terms, crossed branches like a large basket covered with a blend of mud, straw, and animal manure. That's right, manure. They weren't being disgusting. Manure served as an affordable, adhesive insulator and was constantly on hand. Let's face it, these walls, despite being applied with care, had little defense against a serious winter gale. The icy breeze discovered every fissure, every opening, and cheerfully whirled into the single-room houses, circulating constantly and preventing any comfort. Security? None. Heat? Hardly. Next came the roofs. Thatched ones appeared scenic, certainly, but after months of rain and snow, they drooped, leaked, and sometimes admitted neighborhood animals. Few things ruin a nice supper like a squirrel landing on your meal. Windows, when present at all, were ridiculously small and typically blocked with thin animal skins or wood covers. Glass was so costly that even the manor lord likely owned only one small pane, while serfs were thrilled if the wind didn't tear the cowhide from the wall during a blizzard. To compound the issue, floors were often just packed earth that turned muddy during heavy rain or snow. Moisture rose from beneath. So in a sense, they had indoor water seeping through, though they weren't grateful. During winter, each step within your own house felt like walking across a frozen bog. Chill from beneath, chill from above, chill from within it was a multi-directional attack on body warmth. But medieval farmers weren't complainers. They filled crevices with moss, stuffed old cloth into the biggest drafts, and snuggled together. The best human insulation, resourcefulness, perseverance, and sheep fat smeared on walls were frequently their sole defense against turning into medieval ice blocks. When your dwelling was crumbling and your primary defense against nature consisted of mud and goat hair, you could at least laugh kinda if your teeth weren't clattering. As if frigid air weren't sufficient, peasants also faced a quiet foe seeping from underneath the icy soil. Floors weren't truly floors then. They were merely slightly flatter bits of ground inside, if you were fortunate. A layer of straw or old reeds was spread to create a fake sense of comfort. But make no mistake, you were sleeping only a thin layer away from the cold, hard-packed dirt, and that cold was unyielding. It rose from the ground like a malevolent spirit, creeping through the straw into your bones and deep into your being. If you dropped something on the floor during a winter evening, congratulations, it became embedded in the frozen ground. Peasants combated this harsh struggle using several tactics. One approach was placing thick straw mats on the floor. If you could afford them, or more realistically, if you could pilfer enough from a neighbor's field undetected, you might create a reasonable insulating layer. However, straw compacted swiftly, grew mold even quicker, and contributed a crispy noise to your already awful evenings. Some households used dried reeds on the dirt. Periodically, they'd add fresh reeds without removing the old ones. Gradually, this built up a curious ecosystem of rotting vegetation, fleas, and unknown critters. It was essentially medieval carpet, but alive, damp, and smelling like a soaked canine. Even beds, for those lucky enough to have them, offered scant relief. They were essentially wood frames filled with predictably additional straw or hay. Rather than comfortable mattresses, you got prickly, unstable, noisy layers that barely blocked the chill coming from beneath. Sleepless shuffling wasn't about relaxation, it was a desperate, an awkward shuffle to maintain circulation and prevent hypothermia, only one side of your body. In reality, medieval peasants didn't master the frozen earth. They simply adapted to an existence of perpetual discomfort atop it. A restful night wasn't measured by pleasant dreams or plush bedding. It was a victory if you woke up with every toe still intact. And if you managed that, well, you were outperforming the average person. During winter, the unsung hero of medieval dwellings wasn't the roofing or the walls, nor was it the valiant insulation made from mud and manure. The true champion was the hearth, a relentless, crackling fire pit. It stood as the sole barrier against freezing temperatures, pitch-black nights, and the all-encompassing dreariness of medieval existence. In the heart of almost every peasant household lay a humble fire. There was no ornate stone mantelpiece, no tidy chimney directing smoke upward. Instead, there was a crude pit or a stack of stones with partially charred logs. The smoke billowed into the living space so thickly that you'd start to feel like you were being smoke-cured like a ham. Indeed, the majority of houses lacked chimneys entirely. Smoke simply did what it could. It would escape through tiny gaps in the thatch, crevices in the walls, or directly into your respiratory system if it was feeling particularly indolent that night. This arrangement was far from conducive to healthy breathing or longevity. On the upside, the smoke was excellent at driving away fleas and other vermin. Why invest in pest control when you're essentially smoked like bacon around the clock? The hearth provided more than heat. It served as the kitchen, the primary illumination, and occasionally the medieval equivalent of a TV. Families gathered around it to share tales, exchange gossip, or simply gaze into the fire because, honestly, after nightfall, there were few other activities. Sustaining the fire was not a mere convenience, it was an absolute necessity. Allowing the flames to extinguish overnight was akin to inviting the cold inside to deliver the final blow. Moreover, relighting a fire during winter was far more challenging than simply striking a match. You had to rely on flint, steel, kindling, and more fervent prayers than you'd ever uttered in your life. Each family member had a role, prodding the fire, tending the coals, feeding it peat sticks, or, if fortune smiled, a treasured piece of dry timber. This was an unending struggle between human tenacity and the oppressive cold that sought to extinguish your very existence. The hearth was no guarantee of survival, but in its absence, survival was utterly out of the question. That small, smoky, sputtering fire was frequently lackluster, yet during a medieval winter it represented the very pulse of hope. If medieval peasants dreaded anything more than an empty ale barrel, it was allowing the fire to die before dawn. Without that warm, wavering lifeline, the cold would infiltrate more swiftly than a taxman after the harvest, especially in the deepest part of winter. Rekindling a fire from nothing wasn't merely a nuisance, it could prove fatal. Matches were still unknown. Lighters were a fantasy. Rekindling required striking flint against steel and offering a prayer for one solitary, invaluable spark. Then, you had to nurture that spark with gentle care, and whatever dry tinder you hadn't consumed days earlier. Picture attempting this in the bitter cold and pitch darkness, groggy and with fingers numb from frost. Now imagine a starving wolf howling somewhere nearby for added incentive. So peasants became clever and learned to bank their fires. Not in a financial institution, banking here meant deliberately covering the embers with a heap of ash. Just before retiring, the ash served as a thermal blanket, protecting the glowing coals and preserving them, albeit barely, until daybreak. If executed correctly, you could walk over at dawn, gently stir the heap, add new fuel, and presto flames without frozen appendages. But if you messed up, mornings became considerably more frigid and considerably more irritable. Firebanking was a skill transmitted from generation to generation, much like a treasured family dish. Everyone had their own personal tricks. Some advocated for exclusively dry ash, while others swore a touch of moisture was essential. Some compressed the coals firmly, others allowed them air. Merely proposing an improved banking technique could ignite a heated medieval debate. This was the historical equivalent of quarreling over barbecue methods, albeit with significantly graver consequences for survival. Occasionally, banking alone proved insufficient. A gust of wind might slip through a fissure and extinguish the embers regardless. Or, an awkward sheep could accidentally wander into the hearth. Yes, that really occurred. That's why certain families rotated night watches to inspect the coals, effectively the medieval version of stumbling to the thermostat in your sleep. Ultimately, fire banking wasn't so much about conquering nature as it was about securing a handful of extra, vital hours of heat. And if you awoke to find even one dying ember still aglow, that counted as a triumph. It was sufficient to steel yourself for another day of fighting the chill. In the Middle Ages, the saying, "the more the merrier," was not limited to festivities. It was a strategy for winter survival. When the fire crackled weakly and icy breezes whistled through every crevice, there remained a foolproof heat source: one another. And if that required sleeping cheek to jowl with your whole family, neighbors, farm animals, and perhaps a bewildered goose, so be it. Personal space became irrelevant. Privacy didn't exist on those bitter nights. The objective wasn't coziness. It was ensuring you didn't wake up frozen solid to the ground. Whole families converged on the coziest nook of the dwelling, swathed in any rags they could muster. They arranged themselves into what can only be called a frantic, snoring human lasagna. Children wedged themselves between parents, while grandparents burrowed under the outermost layers. And if Cousin Ethel arrived unannounced, well, there was invariably space for another person. The fortunate ones secured a spot in the center, surrounded by warmth radiating from every direction. The unfortunate ended up on the periphery, the medieval parallel of dozing next to a meat locker's door, and pity the soul who tossed and turned too much. One small adjustment for comfort, and you'd send Aunt Maud tumbling into the icy draft. Against the wall, congratulations, you've become the family troublemaker. Bedding was often communal, a shared straw pallet that gradually compressed under the combined weight of successive generations. And considering that hygiene wasn't exactly celebrated in those days, let's just say the sleeping quarters weren't known for their pleasant aroma. But when it's a choice between that and frostbite, you abandon all pickiness. Shared body warmth wasn't merely pleasant, it was tactical. Certain medieval manuals even advised placing the strongest, warmest individuals on the group's perimeter. Acting as human barricades against the cold, Infants and the elderly were nestled safely in the core, valued as the vital little heat sources they were. Yet, this practice extended beyond pure survival. It gradually integrated into everyday routine and familial closeness. Prolonged winter evenings spent snuggled together inspired tales, songs, and certainly some extraordinary dialogues, all muted beneath a communal wool covering. So, the next time your brother or sister snatches your duvet or your dog monopolizes the bed, recall this. At least you're not jostling for room between an uncle who snores and a goat with a critical stare. If you believe modern cohabitants are difficult, medieval peasants would present their seasonal roommates. Cattle, any creature with a heartbeat and a bit of warmth, goats, pigs, chickens, was brought inside. This wasn't just an odd rural custom, it was crucial for survival. Animals generated heat in drafty huts, where the wind howled louder than an empty stomach. Every degree counted, and having a goat nearby also reduced the chance of it being stolen by a neighbor. Come nightfall, the cottage turned into a messy, breathing heater. Hens roosted in corners, pigs grunted by the fire, and cows sprawled against the walls, munching as if they owned the place. Glamorous? Hardly. Picture being stuck in a car during a summer trip with someone who skipped a shower. Now replace that person with a cow, add winter, and have no escape. By spring, the smells were legendary. That shared winter fragrance was overwhelmingly potent. No need for candles when your nose was already on a wild ride. But peasants developed an ability to ignore the stench. They rarely complained because they knew a harsh truth. More animals indoors meant fewer frostbitten toes come morning. Some animals claimed top spots. Cows, being the largest heaters, stayed next to the family. Goats snuggled close for warmth, and because they'd charge in anyway, chickens perched in rafters or baskets, while pigs flopped wherever they pleased. They flopped wherever they wanted, often right in the middle. Naturally, sleeping with livestock had risks. Drifting off peacefully, then jolted awake by a hen perching on your hair or stepping onto something nasty barefoot. Medieval mornings were certainly full of surprises. Despite the noise, smells, and occasional hoof to the ribs, peasants understood the simple calculation. Freezing is deadly, and cows provide heat whether they like it or not. Against winter's icy grip, a cow's warm, damp breath often tipped the balance between life and death. In those days, fashion wasn't about looking good, it was about staying alive. Peasants didn't browse fashion magazines. They piled on garments as if fighting off death itself. The rule: wear everything you own, often all at once. Start with a scratchy, likely grimy linen undershirt. Layer a thick wool tunic over that, then another if you had one. Add baggy leggings that sagged at the knees, a rough cloak across your shoulders. If you were extra lucky, a patched sheepskin on top like a trophy. Congratulations, you're now about 10% warmer and 90% itchier. Boots were a luxury. Most wrapped their feet in cloth or rags and stuffed them into wooden clogs. If the cold still penetrated, you just added more rags and hoped not to lose a toe. Laundering those layers was out of the question in winter. You'd drag them to a frozen stream, break the ice, scrub, then wait 2 days for your only shirt to dry if it didn't freeze solid first. Most peasants wisely decided that reeking of smoke, sweat, and sheep was a fair price for not freezing. Interestingly, the buildup of dirt and grease provided bonus insulation. That grimy layer trapped body heat like a medieval Gore-Tex, just smellier and less socially acceptable. Headwear, scarves, and gloves were treasured items. A simple wool cap could mean the difference between surviving the night or waking with hair frozen to the wall. Gloves were homemade from any leather or fabric scraps, often resembling sad puppets. Children were bundled until they looked like stuffed turnips, waddling around. The aim: capture every bit of precious body heat. Style? Elegance? Never heard of them. Warmth was the real medieval status symbol. Next time you complain about layering for a chilly day, remember peasants wore half their wardrobe at once, looking like lumpy laundry bags and counting themselves lucky. In their world, dirt wasn't just something to scrub off. It turned out grime was a survival tool. Getting dirty wasn't giving up. It was tactical, strategic, even genius. Winter's main problem was heat loss, and clean clothes, especially fresh linen, were surprisingly poor insulators. They breathed, but when temperatures were lethal, breathable wasn't a selling point. That's where dirt came in. As peasants wore their clothes day after day without washing, layers of grime, natural oils, and mud built up on tunics, cloaks, and leggings. Over time, this natural armor clogged the tiny gaps in the fabric, making clothes more wind-resistant. It was like medieval weatherproofing, just smellier. Sure, you smelled like a goat that lost a bet, but you were warm. In fact, some folks believed washing too often in winter could make you sick. Better to keep that protective holy grime barrier intact. Baths were rare, laundry even rarer. Soap, when available, was saved for serious occasions, when the bishop visited, or maybe right before you died. To add to the strategy, peasants layered new clothes on top of old ones without removing the lower layers. You became a walking museum of the past 6 weeks. Each stain told the heroic story of that time. You slipped in the mud but survived. Outsiders might think peasants had given up on hygiene, but they knew better. That grimy, crusty tunic was a thermal shield against frostbite. Not glamorous, but neither is freezing because you wanted to smell like flowers. Besides, when literally everyone stank to high heaven, you weren't offending anyone. Nose blindness was a way of life. So yes, in medieval winters, filth wasn't failure, it was fashion and function. If you had a thick, greasy outer layer by February, you were winning at life. If you thought peasants spent winters in plush feather beds with embroidered quilts, think again. The reality was far more rustic. By rustic, I mean sleeping on a pile of dead plants and hoping for the best. Peasant beds, if any, were usually a rough wooden frame covered with a big sack stuffed with straw, hay, or old rushes. That's it. No memory foam, no orthopedic support, no 5-star hotel experience. That sleeping surface was a crunchy, lumpy, slightly prickly heap with a faint aroma of barnyard and disappointment. Every nighttime movement produced a delightful rustle of straw and the occasional sharp jab from a rogue stem. Some peasants skipped the wooden frame altogether, simply spreading the straw directly on the dirt floor. This offered a lavish, ground-level rest experience that modern trends would likely rebrand as earth-connected slumber. The discomfort of straw mattresses was only the beginning. They had a short lifespan. The straw would compress, grow moldy, attract insects, and eventually become a biological hazard. Replacing the straw was a major event, occurring a few times a year for the diligent, or whenever your bed started shifting on its own without your permission. Many chose rushes as an alternative long grasses laid thickly on the floor. They were sometimes mixed with lavender or rosemary to mask the strong smells of livestock in everyday life. Fresh rushes smelled lovely for roughly a day. After that, they merged into the muddy, trampled indoor landscape, blending seamlessly with dirt, food scraps, and any other debris that wandered in. We must also remember the sleeping companions, fleas, lice, and other delightful creatures that loved straw bedding almost as much as the peasants. If you woke up scratching more than you slept, congratulations, you were experiencing the authentic medieval lifestyle. Despite the hardships, these humble beds were life-saving. Piles of straw provided a vital insulating barrier against the frozen ground. Huddling together on them created pockets of shared body heat, medieval central heating at its finest. So next time you sink into your plush, supportive mattress, recall this: somewhere, a medieval peasant is watching you from history, grinning with a toothless mouth and whispering, "Must be nice." In a house built from sticks, mud, and hope, you quickly learn that winter drafts aren't just annoying, they feel like personal attacks. Medieval peasants fought the cold not only from outside, but also from within their homes, using whatever they could stuff into the cracks. And trust me, there were plenty of cracks. Walls warped, mud crumbled, thatch sagged. The cold seemed to discover new entry points every night, like a mischievous poltergeist with a grudge. Sealing the house became an art. People filled gaps with moss, straw, old cloth scraps, bundles of dry grass, and sometimes even animal hair. Anything soft, squishy, or vaguely insulating, was jammed into a hole somewhere. Some especially determined individuals daubed extra layers of mud and dung over the outside of their walls as an annual winter project. Imagine standing there in freezing weather, slapping cold manure onto your own house while muttering, "This is fine, this is luxury," and in a way, it was. Roof leaks were another battleground. Thatch was cheap and abundant, but not exactly waterproof, especially after a few seasons of rain and snow. Peasants would plug roof holes with spare cloth, reed bundles, or in moments of true desperation, chunks of turf stolen from the nearest field. Every home eventually looked like a slightly sad patchwork quilt made by someone who gave up halfway. If you had windows, you were lucky, but even then, they were little more than wooden planks held by iron nails and sheer stubbornness. Window openings were often covered with animal hides or thick cloth soaked in animal fat to block the worst drafts, adding a bonus aroma of mystery meat to the living space. Each night was a battle between human ingenuity and the relentless, sneaky cold. One moment you were warm, the next, a sudden gust would find the one spot you missed, slapping you awake like a frosty hand of doom. Yet somehow, through cleverness, stubbornness, and a refusal to accept being slightly frozen as a permanent state, medieval peasants patched and stuffed their way through the worst winters nature could throw at them, one muddy handful at a time. When the cold bit hard enough to keep you awake at night, medieval peasants had a solution. Don't even pretend everyone sleeps at once. Instead, they developed a survival strategy that would make any military commander proud: sleeping in shifts. It wasn't a grand system with whistles and roll calls. It was far simpler and much more desperate. Half the household stayed awake, tending the fire and patching stray drafts, while the other half curled up under threadbare blankets and hay, trying to catch a few precious hours of half-frozen sleep. The fire needed constant attention. Left alone, it would die down, and restarting it was about as easy as getting a stubborn donkey to dance. So someone had to be on ember patrol. Since no one wanted to get up once they were finally warmish, families rotated shifts. You dozed for a few hours, got elbowed awake, then stumbled to the hearth to poke, prod, and curse the fire back to life, all while trying not to step on a goat. The rotation wasn't glamorous. There were no night vision goggles, no late-night snacks, and certainly no 5 more minutes snooze buttons. There were just stiff joints, heavy eyelids, and growing resentment toward whoever snored loudest during your shift. Children old enough to hold a stick were pressed into service. They learned early that in winter, everyone pulled their weight or froze trying. Grandparents sometimes stayed by the fire longer, both because of their experience and because arthritis made lying down and getting up again a monumental event. And when it was your turn to sleep, good luck with people moving about, animals rustling, wind battering the walls, and the occasional sharp nudge from a sibling who rolled over too hard. Getting quality rest was a miracle. Yet despite the exhaustion, the system worked. Sleeping in shifts meant eyes and cold, begrudging hands were always ready to keep the hearth alive. The embers survived, and by extension, so did the family. So next time you grumble about waking up to adjust the thermostat or let the cat out, spare a thought for the medieval peasant. He squinted into a smoking fire at 3 a.m., wondering if toes were really that important after all. You know it's cold when you have to think about how you breathe just to stay alive. Medieval peasants didn't just battle the freezing air with cloaks, fires, and creative sleeping arrangements. They even adjusted the way they inhaled and exhaled. To survive the night, the problem was simple. Deep, open-mouth breathing pulled icy air straight into your lungs. In a world where pneumonia could kill you faster than you could say Hail Mary, that was a risk nobody wanted to take. So peasants learned the art of what you might call survival breathing. Instead of sucking in huge gulps of air like they'd just run a marathon, they kept their breathing shallow, slow, and most importantly, through the nose. The idea was to gently warm the incoming air before it hit their lungs. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than coughing yourself into the grave by February. Accidentally inhaling a huge gulp of freezing air? Well, you've just earned yourself a full week of coughing up fragments that seem to come from the depths of your being. Without any physicians around, your grandmother would administer steaming onion tea and earnest prayers. Others would drape sections of their cloaks, shawls, or tattered cloth over their faces during sleep, forming a temporary barrier to warm your breath. Naturally, this resulted in a moist, slightly wet cloth pressing against your mouth come dawn. Still, it was far better than the alternative of freezing internally. Kids learn these techniques from a young age. During the winter months, parents would reprimand children for breathing heavily like dogs indoors. Between disciplined breathing drills, scratchy wool garments, and sharing a bed with a flatulent goat, growing up in medieval winters built resilience like nothing else. At bedtime, nestled in straw mattresses beneath layers of cloaks beside a softly exhaling cow, respiration turned into a deliberate craft. Gentle, nasal, and as restrained as possible, a dark medieval twist on a yoga retreat, complete with frostbite instead of motivational sayings. In the comprehensive guide to staying alive, this approach wasn't the most spectacular, yet it proved effective. With each shallow breath, common folk survived another evening in the never-ending struggle against the cold. Amid the ceaseless conflict with winter, serfs stumbled upon an unexpected advantage: a fully loaded belly. It emerged that one of the most effective defenses against freezing wasn't an additional itchy woolen mantle. The trick was consuming a substantial, dense dish. Just before sleeping, calories equated to heat. The greater the digestive effort your body undertook, the more warmth it produced internally. That's straightforward medieval science. A big supper leads to body heat, and with any luck, you'd last until dawn. To avoid becoming a human icicle, what did medieval commoners heap onto their dishes before an icy night? Imagine hearty broths laden with root veggies, such as turnips, onions, and parsnips. Grains also saved the day: oatmeal, barley porridge, or firm rye bread. If fortune smiled, perhaps, after a holiday or a major livestock kill, you could even score a piece of salted pork or a chunk of dried sausage tossed into the mix. This was not Instagram-worthy comfort cuisine. There was no elegant plating or gourmet decorations. It was a massive, monotonously brown dish, intended to rest in your stomach like a benevolent stone. It would smolder gradually throughout the night, providing you with a marginal increase in warmth. It wasn't merely overeating. It was strategic consumption. Meals that required extended digestion emitted a gradual, consistent supply of heat. Greasy foods were especially valued, not solely for their energy, but because fat metabolizes more slowly than lean flesh. A stomach packed with broth, bread, and a dubious quantity of pig fat represented the ultimate in medieval winter comfort. Parents ensured that even the fussiest kids ate their fill. No one sympathized if young Thomas despised turnips. Devour the turnips or endure a night of shivering while reminiscing about how much you actually wanted them. Tough love, but it worked. Typical medieval parenting. Naturally, a big meal before bed carried some drawbacks. You'd be toastier, but also susceptible to intense, strange nightmares driven by your digestive system straining to cope with a garden's worth of cabbage. Was it worthwhile? Definitely, serfs weren't seeking a gourmet dining experience. They were simply trying to make it through the night. If that resulted in retiring to bed satiated, bloated, and breathing softly through your nose beside a warm cow, so be it. That was merely another evening in the relentless pursuit of witnessing another icy dawn. Ages before electric bedding and sophisticated heated pads, medieval commoners needed innovation for added warmth at night. That's how the modest haybox and the surprisingly glamorous heated stone rose to become winter's overlooked champions. First, the haybox. The name evokes countryside simplicity, and indeed it was simple. Yet the concept was brilliant. Serfs would obtain a robust wooden container, pad it heavily with straw, and then utilize it to hold pre-cooked dishes, maintaining their warmth for extended periods. Remaining broth, warm oatmeal, just place it in the haybox, cover it, and it would remain sufficiently warm for a midnight snack without having to rekindle the flame. Essentially, primitive slow cookers. However, commoners didn't limit this technique to edibles. They recognized that if straw could hold the warmth from a pot of stew, it could also retain heat from an even more valuable source: stones. Thus began the period of the preheated rock. An individual, likely the unfortunate offspring who lost a household dispute, would take a flat rock and toss it into the hottest part of the fireplace. After heating it until it was almost unbearable to handle, walking a razor's edge between beneficial and blistering, they'd retrieve it with a stick or aged tongs. The stone, still giving off delightful heat, would be meticulously enfolded in cloth scraps. It might be wrapped in a worn fabric piece or inserted into a ceramic vessel. Then it would be slid beneath the straw within the mattress or placed at the bed's base. This served as a medieval hot water bottle, prepared to combat the frigid ground. Naturally, there were dangers. If the stone wasn't wrapped correctly, you'd likely start a small, confined blaze. And if it landed on your foot, well, winter mishaps weren't exclusively due to icy patches. Yet, when all went as planned, the rock offered invaluable, soothing heat that could persist for many hours. It was far from opulent, but if you dwelled in a partially ice-covered shack, luxury meant rising without frosticles hanging from your nostrils. Within the extensive toolkit of medieval winter survival, a heated stone nestled in straw may not seem fancy. However, for serfs clutching any warmth available, it represented a minor miracle. In a medieval commoner's dwelling, the fireplace wasn't merely a cooking spot. It was almost part of the household. Yes, it was capricious, smoky, and occasionally unhelpful, yet completely vital for staying alive, particularly at bedtime. Proximity to the flames equated to increased warmth and higher chances of thawing out in the morning. Therefore, sleeping positions prioritized strategic logistics over individual comfort. Babies, seniors, and those unwell or weak claimed top priority for the best spots near the fire. From that central point, parents, teenagers, and robust adults spread outward like protective human blankets. Earning a place near the hearth wasn't merely generous, it was fundamental arithmetic of survival. Infants were delicate warmth producers, while seniors held invaluable family wisdom and, truthfully, the most entertaining rumors. Shielding them with optimal heat was an absolute requirement. However, it wasn't merely pleasant roasting by the fire. Being excessively near meant you might awaken with singed hair or a smoldering cloak. Being too distant turned your sleeping spot into an icebox. It demanded a careful balancing act, staying close enough to enjoy the hearth's radiation, but avoid getting so close that you'd need to justify to your neighbor why you resembled a half-baked joint. The fire's heat distribution was far from uniform. It primarily seared those positioned right in front, leaving the rest battling for the slender wedge of warmth, just like frigid reptiles scrambling for a sunbeam. If fortune favored you to doze off facing the hearth, one side would be delightfully toasty, while the other turned so icy you could wrap your knuckles against it. Animals and farm creatures inevitably push their way in as well. A canine might squeeze in between you and the blaze, its tail swishing perilously near the naked flames. Occasionally, chickens would balance precariously on the hearthstones, softly clucking into the darkness as if they were small, feathered custodians of heat. Each snapping log and every rearranging ember whispered a fragile assurance. You remain alive. You remain warm for the moment. Thus, peasants slipped into restless slumber, soothed by the fire's crackles and sizzles. Every exhalation created tiny vapor puffs in the freezing space outside the fire's feeble ring. This existence wasn't ideal. It wasn't cozy, yet it was living holding onto heat by a slender strand of embers. In medieval times, going through winter solo was a surefire way to end up as a chic ice sculpture come January. Endurance went beyond kinship. It became a whole hamlet's undertaking a chaotic, muddy, noisy partnership where each person's comfort and survival hinged on the collective. Peasants understood that at winter's peak, a robust blaze and heap of straw had their limits. They'd notice if a neighbor's dwelling fell dark. The moment Old Tom's chimney smoke ceased spiraling skyward, someone would investigate. It wasn't solely for the chicken Tom might owe you, though. That could factor in. But because communal bonds were survival itself, hamlets employed informal winter observers, typically the youth or seniors who were unable to farm. Yet they could monitor who was hacking excessively and who had missed trading at the market for several days. They also noted which houses seemed unusually quiet in the morning frost. These sentinels were the Middle Ages equivalent of a neighborhood watch, lacking high-vis gear but armed with many more sheep if a household's fire died. This was practically a crisis. A friendly neighbor would hurry over carrying a live ember wrapped in cloth. Ideally, they'd welcome the family into their own smoky, cramped shack for the night. Certainly, that meant jamming an additional 4 individuals into an already tight dwelling, but it was preferable to discovering frozen companions when the thaw arrived. Shared food reserves also mattered. In particularly harsh winters, communities would combine their final supplies of salted meat, grain, and dried veggies. It was a bleak form of charity. No household was wealthy, but a handful of collective meals might determine whether they limped into spring or didn't. The children grasped the gravity too. They assisted in carrying firewood, distributing hot coals, and dashing off urgent communications when assistance was required. During winter's relentless arrival, no person was deemed too young or too weary to contribute. Of course, medieval settlements weren't entirely warmth and camaraderie. Rivalries flared over land, livestock, or borrows of quality cookware that never truly ceased. Yet as nights turned dangerously frigid, previous animosities were frequently gently set aside. An adversary was still worth salvaging, since the next day could find you in need of aid. At the frozen core of winter, the hamlet transformed into a single, large, obstinate clan, dysfunctional at moments, frequently entertaining, and forever fiercely committed to enduring as one. By advancing one muddy boot, one snapping spark, one icy grin at a time, confronting winter's ruthless chill, medieval peasants didn't solely layer garments or fuel the hearth. They engaged in frequent prayer, for when the wind roared like wolves beyond their flimsy walls and the flame dwindled to gloomy coals, one sought every conceivable edge, including heavenly assistance. Belief wasn't reserved for Sabbaths in those days. It was interlaced with each frosty exhale before burrowing under heaps of straw and coarse wool. Kin would kneel side by side, sending swift petitions to sustain the fire, preserve the ceiling, and keep frost from their toes. Come daybreak, saints transformed from remote sacred icons into winter's primary shield. Saint Blaise, for example, was invoked to guard against throat infections. This was no trivial anxiety when a single breath of frigid air could trigger a fit of coughing that felt like expelling your very spirit. St. Nicholas transcended his later reputation as merely a cheerful present distributor. He was additionally entreated to guard homes from abrupt catastrophe in the sparse, perilous months. Superstitions coiled tightly around everyday endurance. Certain households would splash a bit of holy water by the fireplace before retiring, wishing for protection from malevolent forces, or, minimally, from pesky drafts. Others traced doorframes with consecrated chalk following specific holy days, imploring that warmth and fortune would enter. Candles also served a function. Dedicated vigil lights, frequently blessed by the parish priest or the most devout elderly lady in the settlement, would sometimes stay lit all night. They were a wavering entreaty against the chill blackness scratching at the walls. Naturally, any earnest winter prayer ritual involved a handful of vows. Heavenly Father, if you bring us safely through this evening, I vow to be more considerate to my neighbor, even that turnip thief. I pledge to treat my neighbor better, including the one always pilfering our turnips. Belief wasn't a vague solace. It was a pressing daily dialogue. The peasants sought no extravagance, only endurance, some warmth, some sustenance, and an additional day to stumble onward, until spring finally loosened winter's icy hold on their modest hamlets. It was unvarnished. Elementary hope murmured into the soot-stained beams, entwined with gasping entreaties, and stuffed beneath scratchy covers. That was what somehow bore them through the interminable, cruel winter nights. Despite all the cleverness, supplications, and tenacity medieval peasants hurled at winter, a sobering reality persisted. Occasionally, it fell short. And when winter triumphed, it claimed not merely a handful of unfortunate individuals, but entire kin groups and whole communities. They vanished into stillness under a thick blanket of snow and frost. Certain winters were uniquely brutal, such as the notorious Great Famine Winter of 1315. Torrential rains ruined harvests, cattle perished, and bitter cold converted an already harsh life into a gradual, crushing catastrophe. Desperation ran so deep that terrifying tales circulated of consuming boot leather, tree bark, and in the most appalling instances, one another a total breakdown. Sustaining the flame was far more than an annoyance. It could be a fatal matter. Deprived of the fireplace's scant heat, families would cluster together for their final moments. Occasionally, neighbors would encounter entire homes in the spring, with bodies still entangled in each other's icy embrace, as if attempting to exchange the last shreds of warmth until the very end. Even the homes themselves could cave in under the burden of massive snowfall or violent ice storms. A ceiling collapsing in the midst of a frigid night wasn't merely disastrous, it was usually lethal. Struggling through snow up to the waist to implore neighbors for refuge provided no surety, particularly if those neighbors were already strained to the limit. Illness also thrived in the cold. Malnutrition sapped physical strength, and confined, soot-filled dwellings became incubators for pneumonia, bronchitis, and various other lethal infections. A modest cough in December could swiftly lead to a burial in January, and there was the silent terror of frostbite, fingers, toes, even ears turning black and dying while still attached to the body. Many villagers endured winter's fury only to lose parts of their bodies. It became a somber mark of survival, whispering, "I lived, but the cold claimed a part of me." Still, the truly chilling aspect is not merely the dying, it's how ordinary it all seemed. Communities quietly acknowledged that not everyone would witness the spring melt. Death came without surprise. It was like a familiar visitor knocking, cloaked in ice, patiently waiting. Despite the relentless chill and ever-present danger, medieval farmers persisted dogged, sorrowful, holding on to existence. For as long as a single coal glowed in the fireplace, or a wisp of breath remained in the frosty atmosphere, there remained a battle worthy of their efforts. Reflecting on medieval farmers, those mud-caked, frostbitten victors over eternal winters, it's easy to focus solely on their suffering. However, hidden under chapped palms, numb feet, and soot-filled cottages lies a much greater force, an inheritance of gritty, relentless creativity and unwavering resilience. They lacked radiators, insulated coats, or plush foam beds. They couldn't even take for granted that they would make it to spring. Yet what they possessed and passed down was a master plan for toughness. Each straw-filled bed, every carefully built fire, each crack stuffed with moss, stood as proof of human inventiveness in the face of hardship. Confronted with overwhelming challenges, they didn't break down in hopelessness. Instead, they evolved, gathering wisdom from the environment, from their peers, and from the harsh teachings etched by every unforgiving winter. Their villages were founded on something deeper than common territory. They were anchored in collective endurance. They instructed one another to care for the ill and combine provisions when supplies dwindled. They learned to believe that assisting a shivering neighbor today could ensure assistance for themselves tomorrow. Their existence revolved around the truth that winter cannot be defeated single-handedly. Their spirituality also served as a form of perseverance. They intertwined prayers into everyday routines, motivated not solely by dread, but by optimism. That hope was both delicate and tenacious. The belief that the next day might bring slightly more warmth and light, the confidence that after 100 gloomy nights, spring would return and life would manage to break through the icy soil. And magically it arrived, thanks to their selflessness and their humble triumphs making it through yet another evening, another blizzard. Succeeding generations prospered, inch by chilly inch. They advanced civilization, withstanding winters that earlier generations could hardly endure. Eventually, heating and coziness turned into everyday norms rather than far-off fantasies. Their sacrifice, toil, and resourcefulness are woven unseen into the fabric of our present-day existence. Each snug throw, every heated home, each relaxed winter night enjoying tea beneath gentle lamps, all of this stems from innumerable medieval farmers who declined to surrender to the freezing temperatures. So, when the gale screeches beyond your insulated window, perhaps take a moment to remember them, those anonymous, brave souls who transformed trembling endurance into an ongoing inheritance. Anne Boleyn was not born wearing a royal crown, nor commanding forces at her birth in approximately 1501, most likely at Blickling Hall or Hever Castle. She was the child of Thomas Boleyn, a driven ambassador, and Elizabeth Howard, a noblewoman connected to influential relatives. Within the vast framework of Tudor life, Anne's arrival caused hardly a stir. However, from these humble origins, an exceptional destiny was germinating, a journey destined to eventually redirect the path of English history. Even as a child, Anne stood out, not due to her riches but because of her intellect. She demonstrated sharpness, vivacity, and an undeniable charm, fully aware of her capabilities. Her family dispatched her overseas to the mainland, where her learning genuinely commenced. Initially, she attended upon Margaret of Austria at the dazzling court of the Netherlands, an opportunity scarcely imaginable for most English maidens. There, Anne soaked up the skills of negotiation, courteous behavior, and the intricate maneuvering of continental statecraft. Yet it was within France where Anne's intelligence was truly refined. For years, she dwelled in the cultured courts of Queen Claude and Queen Marguerite of Navarre, acquiring the tongue of authority, grace, playful enticement, and clever humor. While other girls honed their needlework, Anne became expert at dialogue, scheming, and the skill of drawing notice without blatantly pursuing it. When she arrived back in England during the early 1520s, Anne was an uncommon phenomenon. She was a lady capable of matching the refinement of European aristocrats while also bearing the drive of an ascending English lineage. She did not fit the mold of traditional prettiness. Even those who liked her acknowledged this, yet she was captivating. Anne possessed deep eyes that gleamed with sharpness and a lively, melodic tone. Her manner of walking implied a mission subtly hidden behind facets of formal elegance. Anne didn't simply step into chambers, she altered the very atmosphere of the space. During an era when a female's destiny was typically determined by lineage and matrimony, Anne declined to fade silently into anonymity. She had witnessed the influence that charisma and intelligence could exert in overseas courts, and she planned to apply that insight within her own country. Anne Boleyn remained a youthful lady, sharp, aspiring, yet untried, but historical forces were already starting to rouse around her. The woman who came back to England was not merely the child of Thomas Boleyn any longer. She had become a participant in a broader contest, one that would soon involve the monarchy itself. Upon Anne Boleyn's reappearance at the English court, she was a type the aristocrats had never encountered before. Amid a realm abundant with pale, demure English blossoms, Anne was a lightning storm, vibrant, erratic, and utterly inescapable. With her ebony tresses, daring gaze, and fast, incisive humor, she stood out from the soft, compliant women populating King Henry VIII's court. Initially, she enacted the part assigned to her, a lady in waiting to Queen Catherine of Aragon. Yet even while overshadowed by the Queen, Anne's aura shimmered like a flame too radiant to extinguish. She moved elegantly in dance. She articulated French with the fluency of a local and chuckled with a boldness that few females dared exhibit. Gentlemen observed, ladies whispered, the court hummed softly regarding the remarkable woman from Berlin. Before long, she attracted the most perilous notice of everyone, the monarch himself. Henry VIII was quite acquainted with romantic games. His court served as a field of murmured pledges and hidden rendezvous, yet Anne was dissimilar. She didn't swoon at his flattery or tumble readily into his embrace as numerous others did. She playfully provoked. She confronted him. She declined. Henry, accustomed to immediate admiration, became enthralled. The more Anne kept him at a distance, the more intensely he succumbed. Correspondence moved back and forth between them, overflowing with avowals of affection, exasperation, and desire. Henry proposed to her the station of royal paramour, the most influential informal capacity within the court. To everyone's amazement, Anne refused. She refused to become merely another trophy, a forgotten lover erased by history. If Henry desired her, he must take her as his wedded spouse. This was a wager so bold that it left the court dumbfounded. After all, the king was already bound in matrimony. His consort Catherine was cherished by the populace and vigorously guarded by her nephew, the Holy Roman Emperor. The religious establishment itself would need to be contradicted for Henry to win Anne. Yet Anne did not waver. She had resided in Europe's palaces, where monarchs exercised gentle influence discreetly through decorative fans and feigned grins. Anne Boleyn understood that ambition played a risky game, yet she was determined to be its victor. Inside the candlelit corridors of the English court, she made her decision. She aimed not just for admiration, but to alter both her own fate and England's destiny permanently. A fierce flirtation between King Henry VIII and Anne quickly escalated into a nationwide turmoil. Henry was not simply infatuated. He was consumed by an obsession that drove him to dismantle centuries of English tradition. His plan to wed Anne faced a major obstacle. He was already wed to Queen Catherine of Aragon. Catherine, with her dignity and resilience, declined to step back quietly. For 20 years, she had been Henry's loyal spouse, and before God and the English populace, she remained the queen. Catherine was the legitimate queen. Divorce was not merely scandalous, it was nearly inconceivable. Yet Henry was resolute. He persuaded himself. He attempted to persuade all others that his union with Catherine was cursed since she had previously been wedded to his brother Arthur. Even though the Pope had formally approved their marriage years earlier, Henry now claimed his soul would be damned if he did not have the union annulled. Anne, wisely, avoided showing excessive eagerness. She remained tantalizingly distant, sometimes fueling Henry's expectations and sometimes pulling back. Each look and every phrase was carefully calculated. Her goal was not simply marriage. She was maneuvering to become the Queen of England. The court dissolved into murmurs and rival groups. Several noble families actively sought Anne's approval, sensing that the currents of power were changing. Others held tightly to Queen Catherine, appalled by the notion that Anne might take her place. Diplomats dispatched frantic messages to Rome. Foreign rulers threatened reprisal, and Henry's counselors grew nervous, feeling the instability beneath them. As months stretched into years, Henry's irritation intensified. He overwhelmed the Pope with appeals, directed his legal team to discover loopholes, and gradually understood that the Church would not yield readily. Catherine commanded strong allies, among them her nephew Emperor Charles V, the most influential ruler in Europe. Nevertheless, Henry persisted, ignoring counsel. His pursuit of Anne had transformed into something much larger than personal longing, challenging tradition, and even legal norms. This now threatened the very foundation of England's political and religious order. Anne was not merely winning a king's affection. She was pulling an entire realm into unknown territories. A perilous game was underway, leaving no room for retreat. Following roughly 7 painful years of scheming, scandal, and diplomatic turmoil, Anne Boleyn's risk succeeded. In January 1533, she wed Henry VIII in secret, a daring step, since he was still legally united with Catherine. According to the Pope and most of Europe, by June Anne was anointed Queen of England during an opulent ceremony at Westminster Abbey. It ought to have been the pinnacle of her existence, yet the mood was not entirely celebratory. Londoners observed with caution. Some applauded. Others whispered prayers for Queen Catherine. Many questioned whether this new queen, with her French customs and bold demeanor, would bring good fortune or misfortune. Anne assumed the throne not as a cherished icon, but as a tempest. In contrast to Catherine, who represented conventional English humility and devotion, Anne was brilliant, daring, and politically astute. She donned vibrant hues, directed the court with acute cleverness, and swiftly accumulated formidable adversaries. Although her status appeared stable, it was dangerously fragile. Everything depended on a single goal: bearing Henry a son. Anne understood this better than anyone. She was no longer simply Henry's romantic companion. She embodied the aspirations of an entire dynasty. During the early stages of her pregnancy, both Anne and Henry felt overjoyed, convinced they were expecting a son. However, in September 1533, Anne delivered a girl named Elizabeth. To her honor, Anne concealed her profound letdown with elegance, promising that the next infant would definitely be male. Henry, by contrast, struggled to maintain his composure. His gaze, previously brimming with admiration, now showed uncertainty. Yet for a while, Anne's radiance shone intensely. She transformed the English court to reflect her own style, raising her relatives to remarkable positions. She became the first queen in English history to be anointed with the holy oil typically reserved for male monarchs. Her power extended far and wide. Envoys from abroad courted her approval, and nobles reorganized their loyalties to secure her goodwill. The formerly compliant Henry started steering England away from Rome formally, establishing the Church of England with himself as its supreme head, all to ensure that Anne's title as queen remained unchallenged. But even amid her victory, ominous signs appeared. Trusted companions murmured secretly. Adversaries lurked nearby, biding their time, and the capricious, discontented Henry was already shifting his attention away from the extraordinary woman who had reshaped his realm. Anne had secured the crown, yet retaining it required more than charisma, drive, or affection. She had ascended further than nearly any woman of her era, but great heights come with severe consequences. Practically, from the instant she set the crown upon her brow, fissures emerged in her existence. The core of Anne's challenges was the relentless demand to give birth to a son. Her eldest daughter Elizabeth, although intelligent and robust, was not the male heir upon which Henry's dynastic ambitions relied. Time was running out. Anne experienced several pregnancies in rapid succession, but sorrow followed each time, miscarriages that drained her strength and damaged her spirit. Every loss eroded the groundwork she had established. Henry, previously ardently committed, started to distance himself, and his letdown created fractures in their relationship. Anne, who never remained quiet, argued, insisted, and battled to maintain her position. However, Henry, a man who valued both obedience and beauty, became weary of her biting tongue. Her rebellious spirit, the very flame that had originally captivated him, became tiresome. Outside the royal quarters, adversaries assembled like predators. Many aristocrats who had resentfully endured Anne's ascent now blatantly plotted her destruction. The backers of Catherine of Aragon never pardoned Anne, regarding her actions as robbery and blasphemy. Even ordinary people spread rumors about her, dubbing her the Great Whore, and faulting her for the split with Rome and the subsequent severe reforms. Then, Jane Seymour appeared calm, modest, the complete opposite of Anne. Jane seized Henry's drifting focus precisely as Anne's power started to diminish. While Anne had amazed Henry with her intellect and provocations, Jane provided calm obedience. This was a perilous change, and Anne, always sharp-sighted, recognized it unfolding. She attempted to regain her status by showering Henry with affection, vowing to bear more sons, and pleading for forbearance. Yet the king, forever changeable, had already started envisioning existence without the lady for whom he had once shattered a kingdom. Anne's political opponents, among them Thomas Cromwell, formerly her supporter, perceived the shift in circumstances. They initiated preparations for a devastating assault, discreetly collecting allegations, gossip, and testimonies. The lady who had so skillfully navigated the risky pursuit of ambition now found herself losing influence. Anne had earned her throne via trickery and bravery, yet within the harsh, ever-changing environment of Henry's court, former successes held scant value. For Anne, only recent triumphs counted, and her adversaries were honing their blades. The woman who had once broken a realm was about to discover just how swiftly a realm could break her. Instead of launching military assaults or brandishing weapons, Anne Boleyn's foes used hushed rumors, hidden truths, and meticulously crafted deceptions. In the shadowy corners of the palace, treachery was simmering quietly, patiently, and with lethal intent. Thomas Cromwell, previously Anne's most powerful supporter during the English Reformation, had now become her enemy. Their partnership had always been founded on shared aspirations, yet eventually their ambitions diverged. Anne aimed to enact changes that would benefit the impoverished and curb the influence of avaricious aristocrats. Cromwell, on the other hand, desired order, Henry's continued approval, and an absence of any obstacles. Anne's audacity transformed her into a threat, and within Henry's capricious emotions, affection soured into annoyance, distrust, and icy indifference. Very few loyal confidants remained by Anne's side. Her very allure, once her most potent asset, now irritated a court yearning for a softer, more compliant monarch. Meanwhile, Jane Seymour, silent and shrewd, lingered in the wings, offering a stark counterpoint to Anne's dwindling passion. Cromwell acted first, acutely aware of Henry's growing discontent and his desire for an escape route, but without a plausible justification. Cromwell proposed a plan. Instead of a divorce which would embarrass Henry, why not destroy Anne through shame? The allegations were absurd, almost grotesque. Infidelity, incest, plotting against the monarch. The proud, clever queen, now portrayed as a traitor, a seductress, a menace to the very throne she had once transformed. Methodically, Cromwell collected proof, extracting admissions through torment, and recasting innocent flirtations into incriminating statements. Multiple individuals were seized, among them Anne's brother George Boleyn. The accusations were nonsensical, filled with inconsistencies and implausibilities, yet within Henry's court, truth merely aligned with the king's desires. Aware of the closing trap, Anne struggled fiercely. She reminded Henry of their past, of the affection they had known, but it was futile. The very man who once ripped England asunder for her now avoided her gaze in May 1536. Anne was apprehended and transported to the Tower of London, the massive gates clanging shut in her wake. She understood the reality. Her reign was over. She had become a captive, a mere piece ensnared in the ruthless contest she herself had once navigated with such skill. Treachery had determined her destiny, and isolated within the tower, Anne Boleyn anticipated the ultimate action. She confronted a panel of peers in the tower's great hall, many of whom held their ranks and riches thanks to her ascent. Now they served as her judges, detached and observant, ready to eliminate the woman who had once altered the course of English history. The accusations leveled at her were staggering. Sleeping with several men, her brother George Boleyn among them, high treason, plotting against the monarch. In a different realm, charging the queen with such crimes would have been unimaginable, but here they served merely as a show, a dark spectacle crafted to deliver precisely what Henry VIII desired. Anne's ruin, cloaked in a flimsy pretense of law. Anne mounted her defense with the very fierce spirit that had originally captivated Henry. With sharp intellect, accuracy, and a calm that amazed even those against her, she refuted each charge. She pointed out that she had received the Holy Chrism, selected by the Almighty, and consecrated as England's sovereign. She recalled her fidelity, her offerings, her devotion, yet none of it mattered. The outcome had been predetermined well before Anne entered the judicial chamber. The proceedings were a grand show for the court, and populace a public demolition of a former indomitable woman. One witness after another, many pressured or paid, delivered incriminating statements, timelines and venues conflicted. The proof was weak when any existed at all. Yet truth no longer mattered. Anne received a guilty verdict. Her sibling George and the other accused men also faced execution. Anne's punishment was decapitation, a kinder fate than the customary execution by hanging, disemboweling, and quartering reserved for traitors. When the judgment was announced, Anne did not falter. She remained erect, her complexion pale, yet her resolve unyielding. In those last instants before returning to her prison, she articulated plainly that she accepted death, and she beseeched God to grant mercy to her spirit. Once the massive doors shut behind her, a collective sigh of relief swept through the court. The tempest that was Anne, brilliant, perilous, indelible, was almost spent, yet they remained oblivious. They weren't destroying Anne Boleyn. They were etching her into eternity through treachery, sorrow, and folklore. Following the trial, Anne Boleyn went back to the Tower of London. She returned not as the victorious sovereign who had once ruled England, but as a doomed inmate awaiting execution. Yet even confronting her finale, Anne declined to disintegrate. Within the tower's chilly, resonant corridors, she readied herself. She devoted lengthy intervals to prayer, on her knees upon the unyielding stone, hands pressed together, her tone unwavering. She admitted to no wrongdoing, convinced of her innocence. She expressed no fear of death, but hoped her passing would bestow tranquility upon the realm and maybe compassion upon her young daughter Elizabeth. The handful of faithful ladies-in-waiting cried in seclusion, yet it was Anne who consoled them rather than receiving comfort. Occasionally, she quipped with sarcasm that history would recall her as the queen who forfeited her head. That grim wit contained the tenacious essence that rendered her unforgettable. Meanwhile, Henry VIII exhibited no indication of clemency. He had already set his sights on Jane Seymour, well before Anne's scheduled death was confirmed. Henry was planning his subsequent wedding, all while Anne awaited her fate. This ultimate deception from the man who had once dismantled a nation for her surely inflicted the greatest wound. On 18 May 1536, Anne received notification that her execution would occur the following dawn. She found little rest that evening. Rather, she dedicated her remaining moments to prayer, petitioning God to forgive those who had harmed her and maybe even herself for the ambition and arrogance that had brought her to this point. With a trace of royal benevolence, Henry had secured a French executioner to perform the beheading, swifter and neater than an axe. This slight kindness was likely purchased to soothe the king's conscience rather than ensure Anne's ease. As daybreak arrived, Anne donned garments for her last instant. She selected a gray damask gown edged with fur, with a red underskirt hues, symbolizing honor and offering. She arranged her dark locks into a knot concealed beneath a plain bonnet. She steeled herself to confront the sword elegantly, while the tower's chilly dawn fog swirled around the stone courtyard. Anne Boleyn, mother of a queen, a survivor, a warrior advanced. There would be no crying, no begging, just one last display of bravery before the verdict of posterity. Her conclusion approached, yet her narrative had only started. On the morning of 19 May 1536, Anne Boleyn climbed the execution platform, erected inside the Tower of London's enclosure. A modest assembly congregated. Nobles, soldiers, some onlookers, all enveloped in stillness, as though the very masonry held its breath. Anne stood erect, her gray garment stirring gently in the chilly morning wind. She appeared leaner than during her palace days. Her complexion was pallid yet serene. There were no frantic outbursts or sobs. On the contrary, she confronted mortality with that same intense composure that had once brought a realm to its knees. Her speech was short, her last words carefully selected. She leveled no accusations and offered no defense. Instead, she prayed for the king's well-being and success, the same man who had deserted her at the end. Anne gave the world no admission of guilt, but rather absolution. Her bravery left everyone in awe. Even the spectators who had gathered to witness her downfall were transfixed. The French swordsman, imported specifically to guarantee a quick end, advanced as Anne knelt with perfect posture, her hands clasped in prayer and her gaze fixed heavenward. A tiny white blindfold was fastened over her eyes. She held motionless, and the blade glinted once in utter silence. In an instant, Anne Boleyn, Queen Mother, shaper of history, ceased to exist. Her burial was hasty, in an anonymous grave on the Tower grounds. They interred her in an arrow chest, as no suitable coffin had been readied. A monarch who had once worn a golden crown now disappeared without any ritual. But Anne's tale did not conclude in that frigid tomb. Her daughter Elizabeth, the baby whose arrival had once let down a king, would ascend to become one of England's most remarkable rulers. Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, presided over an era that witnessed the flourishing of English culture, might, and worldwide reach. Elizabeth possessed her mother's fiery nature, keen intellect, and stubborn toughness. Anne Boleyn permanently altered England's trajectory. Her aspirations spurred the rupture with Rome and the emergence of the Anglican Church. Her downfall demonstrated that not even queens were immune to being discarded. Yet, via her lineage, through Elizabeth, Anne's legacy shone more brilliantly than any crown she ever donned. Ultimately, Anne Boleyn achieved a form of eternal life not by living on, but by leaving an ineradicable mark on history. Come, the early 1770s, the American colonies bubbled like a cauldron. Kept too long on a blazing hearth, the bond with Britain, formerly regarded as the proud motherland, had curdled into bitterness. Mistrust and escalating rage ensued. The trouble didn't originate with tea. Years prior, the Stamp Act infuriated colonists by levying duties on items ranging from newspapers to playing cards. This was succeeded by the Townshend Acts, which imposed taxes on necessities such as paper, glass, and paint. Every fresh statute, enacted 3,000 miles distant by a parliament lacking colonial voices, acted like another ember dropping into parched undergrowth. Initially, the fury manifested in courteous petitions and inflammatory pamphlets. Provincial congresses penned official objections, traders arranged embargoes, and scribes such as Samuel Adams and John Dickinson saturated periodicals with fervent debates on freedom and entitlements. Yet, as the months dragged on, aggravation intensified into a more ominous sentiment, a gradual recognition that Britain was not heeding their pleas, and, more alarmingly, Britain simply did not give a damn. Numerous colonists held on to the belief that if they just protested loudly enough and argued convincingly enough, Parliament would abolish the duties. Occasionally it worked. The Stamp Act was notably rescinded following vociferous colonial opposition. However, each minor triumph was succeeded by fresh laws, additional tariffs, and further affronts. The dispute was never truly about finances. The levies themselves were trivial compared to British norms, yet the colonists were incensed by the underlying principle. They faced taxation without approval, were regarded as subjects instead of citizens, and governed as remote assets rather than allies. More than any other city, Boston emerged as the pulsating core of opposition. The Sons of Liberty, a clandestine, passionate band of patriots, became increasingly vociferous and audacious. In 1770, hostilities erupted into bloodshed when redcoats discharged upon defenseless townsfolk during the incident later called the Boston Massacre. The cobblestones were already splattered with gore. Trust had evaporated completely. By 1773, the colonies hovered on the brink. One last provocation would push them into outright rebellion. And that insult arrived not as troops, legislation, or military forces, but in the unobtrusive, apparently innocuous guise of chests piled high with tea. The colonists were unaware, but the evening that tea bobbed on the frigid waves of Boston Harbor would alter history permanently. In 1773, Parliament committed a grave error, assuming the American colonies would meekly welcome discounted tea, and thus enacted the Tea Act. This statute was designed to rescue the beleaguered British East India Company while simultaneously reaffirming Britain's authority to impose taxes on the colonies. On parchment, it appeared advantageous. The Tea Act permitted the company to peddle tea straight to the colonies, bypassing intermediaries, reducing costs, and presenting a premium item at a discount. Just a few pence less what could possibly backfire. Absolutely everything. Because the issue was not the cost of tea, it was the doctrine underlying it. The Tea Act preserved the despised duty on tea intact. Agreeing to accept the tea, even at a reduced rate, would signify conceding Parliament's authority to levy taxes on the colonies without their agreement. For many Americans, this was inconceivable. It would be an abdication of the freedoms they had struggled to safeguard for over 10 years. Word of the Tea Act raced like a blaze through the colonies. Traders seethed with rage. They perceived their incomes jeopardized by a stranglehold that would annihilate local commerce. Patriots fumed over the covert implication. The Crown remained convinced it could act with impunity in Boston. The response was particularly intense. Already a metropolis wounded by the Boston Massacre and chronic financial struggles, Boston's citizens saw through the Tea Act. It was a snare cloaked as a deal. Declining the tea turned into an issue of pride, a benchmark for allegiance to the fight for freedom. Gatherings of citizens grew massive. Editorial pages blazed with passionate language. Organizations such as the Sons of Liberty, under the guidance of Samuel Adams and others, coordinated embargoes. They swore that not a single chest of East India Company tea would be offloaded, vended, or consumed on American ground. Throughout the colonies, vessels transporting the contentious cargo were repelled by local opposition in harbors stretching from New York to Charleston. The signal was unmistakable. We cannot be purchased. Yet in Boston, destiny took a divergent turn. 3 vessels, The Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver sailed in, dropped anchor in the port, and stayed put, refusing to depart. Crown authorities demanded the tea be discharged, yet the colonists declined. The standoff stretched as tight as a pulled bowstring, the strain excruciating. One singular action would shatter it, and the course of history would be forever transformed as the British tea ships lay obstinately moored in Boston Harbor. The town itself became a tinderbox. Each passing day without a settlement ratcheted up the strain. Boston was not merely objecting, it was readying for confrontation. In alehouses, chapels, and town squares, furious settlers argued over the next step. The Sons of Liberty, animated by impassioned orators such as Samuel Adams, John Hancock, and Paul Revere, acted promptly to coordinate opposition. Public notices were posted urging citizens to boycott British tea, and lively meetings drew farmers, craftsmen, and merchants together. Each gathering intensified the growing rebellion. The Old South Meeting House became the epicenter of the resistance. Thousands packed into the wooden hall, their breath misting the air as their defiant voices echoed. Inside, resolutions were voted on, speeches delivered, and tempers flared. Each ballot opposing the tea's unloading struck another blow against British rule. Yet, despite Boston's unified front, time was running out. British law required that imported goods like tea be brought ashore and the tax paid within 20 days. If the ships remained past the deadline, customs officials would seize the cargo and forcibly collect the duty. The Sons of Liberty understood that once the tax was paid, even under protest, the principle would be lost. The issue had grown beyond tea. It now centered on whether the colonies would accept being treated as subjects without rights or would rise to defend their future. Meanwhile, Thomas Hutchinson, the royal governor of Massachusetts, refused to yield. Hutchinson insisted that the tea ships could not depart without unloading their freight, demanding compliance with the law, regardless of colonial fury. To him, backing down would mean admitting that mobs, not the monarch, ruled the colonies. Boston's standoff became a public spectacle. Every man, woman, and child sensed that something was brewing, that cold, sharp tension before a storm when the world holds its breath. A single spark could ignite an explosion, and somewhere among Boston's crowded streets and emboldened hearts, a decision was quietly taking shape, a plan that would echo across oceans and empires. The 16th of December, 1773, dawned gray and cold over Boston, a city poised on the edge of history. For nearly 3 weeks, the tea ships had sat in the harbor like ticking bombs. Now the final deadline had arrived. Under British law, the tea had to be unloaded and the tax paid within 20 days of a ship's arrival. Failure to do so would allow customs officials to seize the cargo and call in British troops to enforce the law. Everyone understood the situation and knew what was at stake. If the tea came ashore, the principle was lost. If the colonists allowed it even once, their cause, their claim to rights and liberty would unravel. That morning, thousands of Bostonians and nearby settlers packed into the Old South Meeting House, the largest building in town. Many had walked miles through the icy countryside to be there. The meeting was so crowded that men spilled into the streets, straining to hear the fiery speeches echoing through the halls. Samuel Adams, the unyielding voice of rebellion, presided over the gathering. Speaker after speaker rose to denounce the Tea Act, to cry out against tyranny, and to urge immediate action. Yet even amid the defiance, uncertainty hung heavy. What could be done without sparking outright war? How could they stop the tea without inviting brutal retaliation? As the afternoon wore on, messengers galloped in with grim news. Governor Thomas Hutchinson remained unmoved. The ships would not be allowed to leave without unloading. The tea would be seized, the tax collected, and the king's law enforced. The crowd seethed with fury. The walls of the meeting house seemed to shudder under the force. Samuel Adams stood calmly and uttered the words that ended the debate. "This meeting can do nothing more to save the country." That simple sentence had a powerful meaning. There would be no more petitions or compromises. Action would be taken. Outside, a war whoop cut through the gathering gloom. The signalmen disguised themselves quickly, smearing soot on their faces and donning blankets and feathers in crude imitation of Mohawk warriors. Their goal wasn't to fool anyone, but to create a symbol, a message no one could mistake. The deadline had passed, and Boston would answer not with words, but with defiance. As twilight deepened on the 16th of December, 1773, the quiet streets began to stir. Figures moved through the shadows, ordinary men cloaked in rough blankets, their faces blackened with soot, some adorned with feathers. They weren't trying to convince anyone they were real Mohawks. Their disguise was symbolic, an act of shedding old identities and taking a stand as something new and fierce. Dozens made their way to Griffin's Wharf, where 3 tea ships, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver, lay anchored. The harbor water churned cold and dark beneath them, sharp with the bite of winter air. There was no shouting or drunken chaos. This was a mission carried out with calm, ruthless precision. Armed with hatchets and clubs, the disguised colonists swarmed the ships, overwhelming the few crew members still aboard. No harm came to the sailors. They were pushed aside and watched in silence as the operation began. Men split open the wooden chests with practiced blows, releasing the fragrant smell of fresh tea into the cold night air. Others heaved the crates overboard, their heavy splashes echoing across the still harbor waters. Chest after chest, 342 inches total, was broken and dumped until the dark water swirled with thousands of pounds of tea leaves. Spectators on the wharf watched in silent awe. British guards stationed nearby made no move to intervene, whether from confusion, sympathy, or fear of escalating violence remains unclear. Some accounts suggest that even British loyalists sensed that something had shifted and that there would be no stopping it tonight. The discipline was extraordinary. No cargo was stolen, and no one raided the ships for valuables. Only the tea, the hated symbol of British oppression, was targeted. In a town where hunger and hardship were daily realities, the men could have easily turned the protest into looting, but they did not. When it was over, the harbor looked like a great swirling cauldron filled with torn chests and soaking tea leaves. The smell of the sea, mixed with the sharp tang of smashed tea, creating a strange, bittersweet scent in the night air. The work was done silently. The men disappeared into the night, vanishing into Boston's alleys and back streets. They left no names, leaders, or claims to fame, only the unmistakable mark of revolution. As the last broken crates bobbed in the dark water, Boston stood still, almost holding its breath. The Boston Tea Party was not a riot, brawl, or drunken spectacle. It was something far rarer, a cold, deliberate act of defiance carried out under the cloak of night. The harbor became a giant swirling teapot. Thousands of pounds of East India Company tea floated in great mats on the water, staining it black. Some curious and rebellious colonists scooped handfuls of soaked leaves from the harbor, only to be reprimanded by the Sons of Liberty patrolling the docks. Nothing was to be salvaged. No one would profit from this night's work. This was principle, pure and simple. The next morning, the town awoke to the smell of salty tea lingering in the air, and news spread like wildfire through word of mouth, letters, and broadsheets. By midday, everyone from apprentices to merchants knew what had happened, and opinions split quickly. Among patriots, there was pride fierce, swelling pride that ordinary men had stood up to the mightiest empire in the world and struck a blow for liberty. Among loyalists and moderates, there was horror. They saw the destruction of property as reckless and dangerous. Was there no turning back for the colonies after crossing that line? Governor Thomas Hutchinson stormed through his home, enraged by both the damage and the statement it made. If Boston could so openly challenge royal power, where would defiance appear next? British authorities were caught off guard. They had anticipated demonstrations, economic boycotts, perhaps another upheaval reminiscent of the Stamp Act riots. What they hadn't foreseen were methodical, well-organized rebels quietly annihilating tens of thousands of pounds worth of crown assets. Not a single window shattered. The captains of the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver could merely stand by in dismay as their cargo sank into the water. In the accounting books, the night's financial damage exceeded 10,000 British pounds, an immense sum. Yet, the true cost went far beyond sterling or spoiled tea. That loss was counted in trust, allegiance, and the delicate pretense that Britain governed her American territories with popular agreement. As the tea descended into the harbor, a profound realization emerged, an unavoidable collective certainty. The era of nonviolent demonstration was drawing to a close. Retribution loomed, and Boston stood prepared. Once news of the Boston Tea Party sailed across the ocean and arrived in London, the response was immediate and wrathful. For British authorities, this went far beyond a mere demonstration. It was outright insurrection, a blatantly contemptuous affront to the Crown's authority that demanded action. King George III reportedly turned icy with fury when he learned what had happened. Parliament, already weary from decades of colonial defiance, erupted in indignation and called for penalties not solely against Boston, but as a deterrent for every American colony. The outcome was a collection of laws so severe, Americans soon dubbed these the Intolerable Acts. The initial strike landed without delay. The Boston Port Act, a single harsh measure by which Parliament sealed off Boston's busy harbor. The city's commercial artery was severed until compensation for the destroyed tea was made and peace reinstated. No vessels could dock or depart. Commerce disappeared. Provisions and merchandise dwindled. Boston, previously alive with clamor, turned silent. Its wharves became hauntingly motionless. Yet the retribution continued. The Massachusetts Government Act eliminated the colony's right to self-rule, placing it completely under royal appointees. The Administration of Justice Act permitted Crown agents charged with offenses to face trial in Britain, an unmistakable signal that British officials were beyond local reach. To ensure enforcement, British troops were billeted across Boston. These soldiers resided alongside the very people they were tasked with controlling. The directive was unambiguous. Insurgency would be suppressed. Freedom was a privilege the monarchy would no longer permit. However, Parliament's harsh crackdown produced an unforeseen consequence. Rather than intimidating the other colonies into compliance, it infuriated them. Reports of Boston's plight, its harbor shut, its populace facing famine under military rule provoked profound compassion and justified fury across America. Cartloads of food and provisions streamed into Boston from adjacent colonies. Messages of solidarity, commitments to unity, and clandestine gatherings started binding the previously divided colonies more tightly. What initially appeared as a crisis limited to Massachusetts quickly transformed into a shared American struggle. By penalizing Boston, Britain intended to set a cautionary precedent. Conversely, they turned Boston into an emblem, a unifying call for defiance. The sparks of revolt, previously smoldering in scattered locations, now erupted into a blaze, spreading from one colony to the next, and they would prove nearly impossible to quench. The chastisement of Boston radiated tremors far from Massachusetts's rough coastline, reaching every corner of the 13 colonies. Indignation gave way to something Britain found far more threatening: solidarity. For generations, the colonies had behaved like estranged relatives, squabbling and vying with one another, divided by terrain, faith, and commercial conflicts. Yet, when Parliament bolted Boston's port and removed Massachusetts's autonomy, colonists throughout the continent understood. If Boston was vulnerable, no colony was safe. From Virginia to Pennsylvania, South Carolina to New Hampshire, reactions came fast. Colonists dispatched carts laden with food, provisions, and messages of support to Boston's beleaguered residents. Local assemblies simmered with fury, and newspaper presses ran around the clock disseminating the reports. The struggle was no longer exclusive to Boston, it belonged to all. Consequently, in September 1774, an extraordinary event unfolded. The inaugural Continental Congress assembled in Philadelphia. For the very first time, delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies met in one place to deliberate a coordinated reaction. Individuals such as George Washington, Patrick Henry, John Adams, and Samuel Adams, previously known only within their localities, now emerged as the movement's designers. That movement expanded every day. Their objective, at least on the surface, was not yet complete separation. The majority still yearned for a restoration of the earlier harmonious bond with the British monarchy. However, Underneath the courteous discussions and diplomatically phrased appeals, a profound realization was germinating. The colonies could no longer remain isolated within the Congress. They concurred on a comprehensive embargo of British products. They vowed to back one another against any additional British hostility. Furthermore, they explicitly stated that aggression against a single colony would be regarded as an assault on every colony. Throughout the land, in drinking establishments and assembly halls, everyday citizens started uttering terms that had previously been spoken only quietly: solidarity, defiance, freedom. By coming down harshly on Boston, Britain believed it would suppress revolt. On the contrary, it fused the colonies into a far more formidable entity, a populace that, notwithstanding their distinctions, started viewing themselves not as fragmented territories but as Americans. The breezes of revolution were no longer merely rustling. They were coalescing into a tempest, and Britain had missed the opportunity to halt it. On the evening the tea plunged into Boston Harbor, more than just wooden chests were obliterated. The pretense that the American colonies could perpetually stay obedient subjects was also destroyed. The Boston Tea Party ignited a flame that no monarch, no military force, and no faraway legislature could ever extinguish. Over the subsequent months, that flame spread throughout the colonies. What were previously demonstrations, economic embargoes, and courteous entreaties transformed into outright defiance. Local militias started drilling in plain sight, and warehouses became stocked with gunpowder and ammunition. Individuals who had previously raised glasses to King George III in alehouses now murmured about rebellion beneath those same rooftops. Boston evolved into an icon of suffering, bruised yet unyielding. The harder Britain attempted to squeeze, the more the colonies eluded its grasp. Every vessel that navigated past the sealed, quiet port of Boston stood as a quiet testament that oppression had encountered its equal in American resistance. When Parliament enacted the Intolerable Acts, their aim was to turn Boston into a cautionary tale, intimidating the remaining colonies into obedience. Conversely, they gave birth to a city of martyrs, a unifying shout from Georgia through New Hampshire. Colonists came to understand that their destinies were interlinked. Defiance ceased to revolve around tea. It became a matter of existence, self-definition, and liberty. By the spring of 1775, the strain escalated to a crisis just outside Boston, in the hamlets of Lexington and Concord. Redcoats dispatched to seize colonial arms discovered instead farmers with weapons, everyday individuals prepared to safeguard their liberties with gunfire. The initial gunshots of the American Revolution echoed. An unbroken chain led back to the instant when people opted for conviction over financial gain and cast an enormous value of tea into the water. The Boston Tea Party demonstrated to the world that insurrection does not invariably herald itself with fanfares and flags. Occasionally it commences softly, with a handful of resolute individuals enduring the chill, opting for resistance rather than intimidation. By heaving the tea overboard, the colonists were not merely refusing a levy, they were renouncing an entire empire. And even if the journey forward would be violent, acrimonious, and unpredictable, one certainty emerged that evening in Boston Harbor. Once loyal to the crown, the American colonies had transformed into something unprecedented and perilous: revolutionaries. And their journey had only begun long before the Great Pyramids of Giza ever pierced the horizon. Before Mesopotamian cities hummed with activity, before Stonehenge rose against the heavens, Carroll existed. Tucked within the arid valleys of Peru's coast, Carroll emerged in quiet grandeur almost 5 millennia ago. It then slipped into near total obscurity, devoured by desert sands and erased from memory. For hundreds of years, humanity remained unaware of its presence. The vast valley that once cradled Carroll appears, on first look, an improbable cradle for an advanced society. The terrain is dry and desolate, the river barely a delicate silver streak snaking among stones and grit. To many observers, it seemed utterly forbidding, a spot forsaken by living things. But right there, in that barrenness, one of humankind's first major urban centers began to form. Carroll was no mere cluster of random shacks or a fleeting marketplace. It was a meticulously designed metropolis, covering 150 acres, boasting pyramids, public squares, living areas, and ritual grounds. It possessed magnitude, intention, and foresight, a sophisticated culture blooming centuries before Egyptians began piling stones for their own pyramids. The inhabitants of Cairo accomplished this feat without wheels, writing, or metal implements. They erected enormous structures from rock and soil, using only creativity, collective labor, and sheer human determination. Yet for millennia, Cairo's existence stayed hidden. Even when explorers accidentally came upon the odd, eroded hillocks dotting the valley, they dismissed them as natural features, simple mounds shaped by arid winds. Nobody suspected that underneath the sand rested one of Earth's most ancient urban centers. It was older than the societies that historical records once hailed as the earliest. Only in the late 1900s did archaeologists, headed by Ruth Shady, reveal the reality, their discovery. Concealed within the sands of ages, it was destined to reshape the narrative of the Americas. It compelled humanity to rethink its assumptions regarding the dawn of civilization. Cairo had emerged, thrived, and crumbled in absolute obscurity. Now, following thousands of years of quiet, its stones once again communicate, softly telling tales of a calm, wise populace. They created a realm of intricacy and marvel in a region where survival appeared unfeasible, and that was merely the first chapter of their tale. At first sight, the Supe Valley appears to be a locale where life would barely exist. Fierce winds blow across vast dunes and rocks. The sun blazes relentlessly, parching the soil and hardening the terrain into cracked, brittle crusts. Water is rare. The river, a winding ribbon, struggles to persist in the view of an inexperienced observer. It appears as a desert, sterile, void, abandoned by divine forces. Yet the inhabitants of Cairo perceived a distinct reality. They didn't view an intimidating wasteland. Instead, they recognized a raw surface ready to be crafted. They understood the river, though small, as the vital artery of opportunity. Therefore, with perseverance, creativity, and absolute resolve, they transformed this harsh environment into a flourishing hub of existence and civilization. Their initial triumph came through farming. They mastered the river's periodic overflows, constructing basic yet clever canals that distributed water throughout the valley. In places where most people observed only grit and debris, they nurtured sprouts of optimism: cotton, beans, squash, guava, and sweet potatoes. Cotton especially turned into their prized asset. It was woven into nets and fabrics, stimulating exchange with seaside settlements and forging connections that extended well past their arid homeland. Yet cultivating plants represented just one facet of their expertise. Cairo's inhabitants recognized that enduring the desert demanded equilibrium. They collaborated with the environment rather than opposing it. Their dwellings and squares were constructed from rock and soil, engineered to endure intense heat and occasional heavy downpours. The rains would sometimes rush through the valley. They observed celestial bodies and seasonal patterns, scheduling their planting with the accuracy of skilled stargazers. Commerce served as the circulatory system of Cairo's economy. Preserved fish, cotton, fruit, and artisanal items moved along the coastline. In return, Cairo obtained foreign products: vibrant seashells from the Pacific, precious rocks from the Andes, concepts from remote cultures. They were never cut off, they were linked. In a territory where persistence appeared hopeless, Cairo prospered via wisdom, inventiveness, and togetherness. They didn't subdue the desert through sheer strength. They collaborated with it, grasping its cycles and honoring its might. They constructed a civilization that was not merely operational, but remarkable given all challenges. Cairo bloomed into a guiding light of human culture, and it was merely starting its ascent. Emerging from the sands like age-old sentinels, Cairo's pyramids challenge every prior assumption about early American societies. These were not tiny, rough constructions raised by unskilled laborers. They were enormous, intentional architectural achievements designed by a populace possessing foresight, structure, and drive. The focal point of the metropolis was the Pyramid Mayor, the most massive among Carroll's grand constructions. It extended over 450 feet in width and rose almost 60 feet above the arid ground. An engineering accomplishment comparable to the ancient world's early marvels, assembled using stone, clay, and woven reed sacks packed with rubble. This pyramid was crafted not only to survive the severe weather, but also to resist the violent tremors that frequently shook the area. And persist it did, remaining mute against gusts and ages for almost 5,000 years. However, Carroll's pyramids were not burial chambers. Unlike Egypt's grand mausoleums, they fulfilled a distinct function. They acted as hubs for rituals, authority, and community activity. Sanctuaries and assembly areas topped their peaks, reachable via wide, graceful steps. Flames once blazed on these raised surfaces, and ceremonies took place under the boundless Peruvian heavens. At the base of the pyramids, expansive squares spread out depressed and round, welcoming large crowds for spiritual rites, governmental assemblies, and shared festivities. The entire layout of Carral's urban plan indicated a culture that valued togetherness and structure, a populace intimately bonded to each other and to the universe. Surrounding the pyramids, smaller living quarters radiated outward, probably housing clerics, managers, craftsmen, and agricultural workers. The pyramids themselves appeared deliberately positioned, oriented toward astronomical phenomena, dawns, solstices, star patterns for Carroll's inhabitants. Building was not merely functional. It held spiritual, numerical, and universal significance. Moving among the aged rocks today, one can hardly avoid a peculiar feeling of wonder. These edifices were erected lacking metal instruments, wheels, or draft animals, yet they ascended with balance, magnitude, and astonishing accuracy. The grand pyramids of Carroll were constructed neither for pride nor conflict. They were raised to link ground and heaven, society and universe, mortals and timelessness. And even now they murmur through the dunes, recounting a tale that defies erasure. Within the remnants of Carroll, there exists a deeply distinctive quality, a factor that distinguishes it. Unlike numerous ancient cultures, no armaments have been unearthed beneath its soil. No fortifications enclose its squares, no collective burial sites indicate violent takeover or civil conflict. In contrast to empires that emerged and collapsed via warfare, Carroll was a community founded on harmony. This is a discovery that overturns assumptions. This was a culture that prospered not via aggression, but through collaboration, commerce, and common faith. Instead of pouring resources into military forces or defensive walls, Carral's inhabitants dedicated themselves to building, stargazing, making music, and fostering community togetherness. Their squares and stepped structures served not as tributes to battlefield triumphs, but as hubs for festivity, devotion, and administration. Here was a society that preferred assembly over aggression and diplomacy over devastation. Commerce formed the very pulse of Carral's prosperity. Cotton cultivated on the rich riverside soils was transformed into fishing nets exchanged with seaside settlements. In exchange, Carral obtained preserved fish, a vital protein supply, alongside treasures from distant lands, vibrant seashells from the Pacific shore, gemstones from the highlands, and exotic tropical fruits from remote valleys. This extensive exchange system wove the area into a cohesive, peaceful network of reciprocal advantage. At its heart, Carral flourished as both a cultural and commercial center. Spiritual and ritual practices were essential for preserving social balance. Carral's expansive public areas and recessed plazas probably functioned as arenas for ceremonies that bonded the populace through common faith. Melodies from condor bone flutes and deer-hide drums filled these assemblies, generating acoustic landscapes that resounded throughout the arid terrain. These auditory experiences connected personal existence to a higher purpose. Governance in Carral seemed rooted in religious influence and urban management rather than armed might. Its rulers likely orchestrated enormous building endeavors, seasonal farming rotations, and intricate commercial accords, none of which bore the violent marks of warfare. Amid a past frequently characterized by strife, Carral emerges as a brilliant outlier. It demonstrates that a society can flourish without subjugating others. Rather, civilization can arise through the gentle strength of teamwork, innovation, and mutual reliance. In Corral, the very stones appeared to vibrate with remnants of a bygone era. This was far more than a settlement of structures and commerce. It pulsated with noise, tradition, and sacred cadence. Melody and ceremony were intricately threaded into the core of Corral's culture. Researchers, excavating cautiously in the arid soil, discovered a wealth of historic musical devices. This collection included flutes made from condor and pelican bones, whistles carved from deer antlers, and miniature drums fitted with animal skins. These items were far from child's play. They were meticulously fashioned and adjusted to precise pitches. Their purpose was to project audio throughout the city's spacious squares. In the absence of a written script, melodies communicated the tongue of the spirit. Picture this: the deep vibration of drums swelling at twilight, flutes wailing akin to the arid breeze, footsteps pounding on the recessed squares while crowds assembled in the dimming daylight. Blazes would flare on the pyramid summits. Clerics adorned in elaborate textiles would intone hymns to the deities of the watercourse, the ground, and the celestial bodies. During those instances, Carol transcended being merely a metropolis. It became an orchestral performance. Its very design indicates that ceremonial existence was fundamental. The expansive squares were not just empty areas. They served as platforms for collective rites, deliberately shaped to unite individuals. The circular depressed enclosures functioned like prehistoric theaters, concentrating audio and visual attention on the ceremonies conducted in their midst. Towering over everything, the pyramids stood not as burial places, but as holy peaks constructed by human effort, connecting the terrestrial to the celestial. Ceremonies probably celebrated seasonal changes, agricultural cycles from sowing to reaping, and stellar motions. Melody was more than amusement. It formed a link among individuals, between nature and the sacred, between the understood and the unknown enigmas. Carol lacked any warlike paintings, fearsome combat deities, or gruesome offerings. The religious domain appears to have been characterized by concord, festivity, and awe. Still now, as the dry breeze moans among the remnants, you can nearly perceive it. The faint echoes of archaic tunes, the lost melodies of a populace who discovered elegance, purpose, and unity amid the severe, boundless dunes. Carol was much more than merely a musical location. Commerce and ceremony. This was an engineering wonder, proof of human resourcefulness in one of the planet's most unforgiving environments. Lacking metal implements, the wheel, or beasts of burden, Corral's inhabitants forged a settlement from rock and soil that has persisted for almost 5 millennia. Their accomplishments were truly remarkable. Colossal pyramids emerged from the arid ground, built not from tiny brittle blocks, but from huge boulders hauled across the arid valley. Laborers moved stones with reed sacks, clever containers, robust enough to handle significant weight, woven from the vegetation thriving on the riverbanks. They constructed methodically, tier by tier, piling rock and packing the cores with debris. The resulting edifices could endure not just centuries, but also the wrath of the elements. Moreover, they possessed deep knowledge of the environment. Carol is situated in an area susceptible to powerful tremors, yet its pyramids and squares remained mostly undamaged. The secret? They perfected seismic-resistant building methods. Constructors employed flexible design approaches, stratified backfills, broad bases, and curved edges that enabled their structures to soak up and scatter earthquake forces. This was engineering derived not from manuals, but from a profound comprehension of the ground beneath them. Hydraulic control was another understated achievement, even though they inhabited a wasteland. Corral's inhabitants crafted advanced irrigation networks. Ditches and aqueducts precisely directed stream water onto their farmlands, enabling harvests to prosper even in arid periods. Not a single drop of water went unused, and each one counted. The very design of Corral showcased exceptional city planning. Principal edifices were oriented toward significant celestial markers, indicating a thorough grasp of the sun's patterns. The recessed squares, with their exact shapes, served functions beyond mere assembly spots. These plazas functioned as devices for monitoring the skies, enabling clergy and sky watchers to forecast seasonal changes, a vital skill for endurance. The city's arrangement itself indicated a sophisticated population. Living districts, governmental sectors, and ritual hubs were all organized cohesively, harmonizing public existence with hallowed areas. Their construction was intended not merely for the present, but for countless descendants. Nowadays, when contemporary architects admire Corral's durability, they are reminded that excellence is not gauged solely by technological advancement. Often, the profoundest insight resides in comprehending natural forces, cooperating with the terrain rather than opposing it. The stones of coral have weathered tempests, seismic events, and the gradual decay of centuries. They remain as a quiet witness to a society that inscribed its aspirations into the arid landscape. For many hundreds of years, the settlement of Corral thrived as a symbol of tranquility, melody, commerce, and construction skill amidst the dusty dunes. Then, softly, nearly without any clue, it was deserted. No conflagrations signified its decline, no evidence of invasion defaced its ramparts, no collective burial pits or demolished landmarks narrate a tale of abrupt catastrophe. Rather, Corral gradually dissipated, its squares cleared, its pyramids surrendered to shifting sands, its wind instruments and percussion muted by the passage of ages. What prompted their departure? This query still haunts. Similar to a phantom over the super valley, certain academics think that climatic transformation delivered the decisive hit. Data indicates that a prolonged dry spell might have devastated Corral's farming. Bereft of the stream's vital moisture, the croplands would have shriveled. Commercial webs relying on extra cotton and provisions would have collapsed. The delicate equilibrium Corral had sustained with its severe surroundings might have ultimately become irreparable. Alternative hypotheses suggest alterations in exchange pathways as adjacent societies expanded and fresh power hubs arose both on the shore and interior. Corral's sway may have waned. Maybe the traditional goods they had traded, cotton, fish, agricultural products, could no longer maintain their status as a leading metropolis. Gradually, the economic vitality ebbed away. Some also murmur about decay from within. Since no documents survive, we merely speculate about power conflicts, spiritual turmoil, or mere weariness following centuries of expansion. Even harmonious communities can break apart when scarcity threatens existence. Regardless of the reason, the exodus appears slow rather than abrupt. Households probably left individually, searching for richer lands, mightier rivers, fresh starts. Kids, who had once dashed through Corral's squares, later narrated tales of a vanished metropolis in their wake tales that ultimately dissolved into myth. The arid landscape took back human constructions, and breezes swept minute grains over rock sanctuaries. Musical instruments rested hidden under moving dunes, and a once buzzing, lively society turned into a landscape of quiet, slumbering hills. For roughly 4 millennia, Carroll stayed concealed, a murmur beneath the desert awaiting discovery. Nowadays, as excavators delicately expose its masonry, the inquiry persists: how can a civilization so sophisticated, so elegantly constructed, just disappear? Maybe the reality is that even the most magnificent cultures, however enlightened or tranquil, remain delicate strands in the fabric of history. They stay perpetually susceptible to invisible currents of transformation. For ages, Carroll rested unnoticed, interred under the quiet dust of the Supe Valley. Wanderers strode by the peculiar dome-like mounds scattered across the terrain. They had no idea that underfoot rested remnants of a society more ancient than Egypt's pyramids. In their eyes, these were mere geological features, knolls sculpted by wind and ages. Only in the closing decades of the 1900s did the world at last perceive Carroll's whisper anew. During the 1990s, Peruvian scientist Ruth Shady guided an expedition into the Supe Valley. She was motivated by inquisitiveness and an increasing conviction that those mounds harbored mysteries unknown to anyone. Their discoveries would completely transform the narrative of human society in the Western Hemisphere. Slowly and meticulously, the dust was swept aside. From underneath rose partitions of precisely shaped rock, majestic steps, depressed courtyards, and stepped structures. This was a metropolis much more ancient than anyone had conceived. Carbon 14 testing verified the incredible. Carroll existed more than 46 centuries ago, flourishing concurrently with the earliest cultures in Mesopotamia and Egypt. This finding rattled the very bedrock of archaeological understanding. Before Carroll's revelation, academics thought that advanced societies in the Americas emerged significantly later, overshadowed by the mighty empires of the Eastern Hemisphere. Carroll turned that view upside down. It demonstrated that the Americas had generated impressive construction, intricate city existence, and societal structure on their own. This happened well before the Incan or Mayan empires appeared. Ruth Shady and her crew uncovered not merely rocks and debris, but traces of daily existence. Instruments for making sound, nets for fishing, woven fabrics. They also discovered quipus, knotted record-keeping devices, and objects dedicated in worship. Every relic narrated the tale of a population that constructed a community with foresight, intellect, and deep inventiveness. Carroll's reemergence was far beyond a scholarly victory. It represented the rebirth of a culture that had slumbered under the arid sands. It rested for millennia and then reappeared beneath the open air again. Its squares were caressed by the identical breezes that once bore the notes of pipes and the giggles of young ones. Currently, Carroll holds status as a UNESCO World Heritage location, a delicate, invaluable connection to humankind's primitive aspirations of constructing, bonding, and having faith. The desert particles had concealed Carroll effectively, yet ultimately the rocks persisted, anticipating an observer to hear, to perceive, to recall. Today, Carroll remains a quiet colossus, a testimony that the foundations of societies run far more profoundly than we previously thought. Amidst its step structures and courtyards, the age-old stones murmur a narrative that reconfigures our comprehension of humanity's path. A tale not about domination and violence, but about balance, creativity, and optimism. Long ago, before the mighty states of Greece, Rome, or even Egypt emerged, Carroll's inhabitants were crafting something remarkable. They erected step structures without employing the wheel and charted celestial bodies without written documentation. They cultivated a flourishing community based on commerce, melody, ceremonies, and construction without any markings of conflict on the terrain. During an age frequently characterized by warfare, Carroll provides an alternative image of what a society might be. A community that prized bonding higher than subjugation, understanding above control. It reminds us that sophistication does not necessitate brutality. Magnificence is not gauged by the number of troops that cross a combat zone, but by how a populace unites to construct, innovate, and envision. Corral's influence extends well past the arid dunes of the Supe Valley. It questions ancient beliefs that advanced society originated from one sole location. That city dwelling and impressive construction were initially the domain of the Eastern Hemisphere. Carroll demonstrates that the human drive for ingenuity and ambition emerged separately in numerous regions across the globe, molded by various artisans but propelled by identical timeless longings to continue, to rejoice, to ascend toward the sacred. Nowadays, strolling through Corral's eroded remnants, one can nearly perceive it, the beat of drums, the soft drone of wind instruments, the chatter of merchants haggling in the squares, and the giggles of youngsters dashing along rock lanes. Beneath a canopy of infinite stars, their existences, their aspirations, and their narratives remain present, inscribed into the very core of the planet. Carroll instructs us that even when societies collapse, their soul can persist, slumbering beneath dust, anticipating remembrance, awaiting inspiration anew. On the vast chronology of human existence, Carroll gleams not solely as an artifact of yesteryear, but as a lighthouse for tomorrow. It serves as a note that even in the most severe deserts, even below the thickest sediments, the spores of awe, knowledge, and tranquility can sprout and cultivate a society that strives toward the heavens.